Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. This is our second from last session, and I'm particularly excited about this one. We are going to be joined today by Dr. Maisa Akbar from the American Psychological Association. And our plan today is to have a really robust and meaningful conversation around the redefinition of DEI, centering psychological science. Um, Dr. Akbar and I will lead the conversation, and yet we'd love to bring the audience into that conversation. So please bring your questions and let's hear them as we go along, and we'll try to bring you in on that conversation. So let's go ahead and get started, Dr. Akbar. One of the things that is always fascinating for our audience is when our speakers really talk about their personal why and their purpose and meaning. We know that people do their best work when it's deeply personal for them and it's connected to something. And just to ground us, what inspired you? Tell us what inspired you to take this work on, and how does it continue to fulfill you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I can't answer that question without bringing in my lived experience. And I bet you that if you took any collection of, D&I, EDI, the way that we call it, practitioners, there would be a common thread that we would have around that. And for me, that is that I am, the only child of immigrant parents, first generation college student, first person to really move our family into a different uh, area of success. And even though they had a really interesting way of viewing their success in this country, that didn't really materialize the way that they thought, right? And I think that when we talk about the spirit of DEI, that's really why we're here, to make way for those that were vulnerable, marginalized, set aside. And so that lived experience combined with my background as a psychologist, my background has been primarily focused on my professional career on race-based trauma. So looking at the effects of racism on our mental psyche, on our mental health and well-being, and taking that combination of understanding human behavior, understanding the impacts of discrimination, bias, hate, violence, and what that does to us and the kind of toll that it takes on us. And then now you throw in sort of the mix of my lived experience. I felt that I was like well suited. It was predetermined that this was kind of going to be my path. So I'm excited to be here and to talk about this very important topic with you in the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Akbar, for sharing that personal story. And as we think about spirit, and as we think about making way, and as we think about making space for the vulnerable and the marginalized, what do you think? What are we trying to solve for here? How would we name this problem?
Yeah, I think that we have really evolved as a field. I think, diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness, so many aspects of this, particularly within the last, 5 years, more specifically during COVID and post COVID, there's been an extreme expansion of the definition. And I think that when I talk to professionals in the DEI arena, most of them are saying that they are trying to move away from checking all of the boxes, that sort of traditional view of looking at this as a supplier diversity issue or an issue related to compliance, to really trying to establish what healthy workplace culture is going to look like. And that so that it allows that every team member is not only able to perform their best, but they're able to feel their best when they're at work. And I know that as a chief diversity officer and those that are chief diversity officers here, you feel an incredible pressure to try to deliver on that, right? There are words that we are using now that traditionally were never acceptable in the workplace. And I think that we're undertaking an incredibly different way of viewing this. And we want to create inclusive and welcoming workplaces, especially amid the pandemic and the racial reckoning. And you're contending with things like the great resignation, for us in mental health, we know that it wasn't just a pandemic that hit us. We're really speaking about this as a syndemic, knowing that a mental health crisis is not just looming, it's here, and that people are experiencing high rates of suicide, high rates of anxiety and depression, and so many other things that are, related to the pandemic and all of the societal issues that we are reckoning with. And we have to incorporate all of those societal issues and figure out how we are still going to create welcoming and inclusive workplaces. Not because it's just a good thing to do, but it's because it's the right thing to do. It's actually business imperative for us to do it, to strategically map this out and implement a way in which DI is going to critically help our businesses thrive. So, there's so much complexity to this, and the job can be so, difficult and overwhelming. But I know that the problem, as you said, that we're trying to solve is to fully integrate what's happening in society with with the culture of our businesses, and trying to sort of understand how to equip employees not to get over or go back to, but instead how to cope with what's happening, in our world and what's happening within our workplaces.
Mm, yeah, and if I could, I hear these big ideas of from and to, which is from a traditional view to a more broad, healthy workplace. I
Yes.
also hear some paradoxes. It's really complex, and yet it's business imperative. So we
That's right.
have to we have to figure it out. And then the other paradox is, or the other and versus an either or is integrating societal with business culture. So
Yes.
many paradoxes and many challenges, and just so that our audience.
Can I expand on that too? I think that it is beyond us now to say, like, hey, everyone's got to check their problems at the door, and you're not allowed to bring those problems in, like that way of thinking. First of all, it lacks contemporary, ideas of DEI. But I think that the other piece that's really important is that, APA did a work and well-being survey in 2021. And what we found was that when we are able to prioritize mental health and we see the importance of it, in that survey, 59% of employees said that mental health is a necessary part of the work culture after the pandemic began. So we know that this idea of checking problems at the door, or almost disassociating with your whole person, doesn't work. And it's almost like the antithesis of inclusivity, right?
Right. And, I think more and more organizations are moving towards that. The Conference Board did an incredible study also, really around, when are organizations thriving and when are they at their best in that magic quadrant in the top right. And it was really about well-being, both physical and emotional, as alongside high productivity. And so we share that perspective with you, Dr. Akbar. And I think it's about organizations having and conversations
Yeah.
versus either or, right?
Yes. And like you
Yeah.
said, it leads to greater productivity, greater innovation, higher rates of employee retention. So this is a bottom line issue just as much as it is a whole person issue.
Indeed.
From the lens of psych science, we of course want to promote whole person, attitudes in order to create healthy workplaces. But we also understand the need to drive high performing, environments, and the need for, what those high performing environments call for. And what we're saying, as you just said so clearly and are, gracefully, is that it's an and both. One does not have to be sacrificed for the other.
Indeed. Now, just for our audience, just to give them a glimpse of where we're going to go a little bit deep into the science, and we're going to leverage Dr. Akbar's real psych background. Then we're going to say, and what does this mean practically? How can organizations take all of that rich and beautiful content, and then how do we apply it practically? So let's go a little bit deeper. How can psychological science be used to either solve or resolve some of these paradoxes that we've just described, Dr. Akbar?
Absolutely. It's so important for us to understand the role of psychologists, right? So, psychologists are experts in human behavior, and this is a human issue, right? Your workforce is made of humans that will have different ways of thinking, believing, behaving, different attitudes. And so, what the science does is that we're able to discover and advance and rectify problems that are fundamental to human behavior, and we are able to unpack and uncover how people interact in different ecosystems. So, an ecosystem can be considered a business or an organization, anything that's systemic, and it's made up of people. And, when we're applying psych science in this conversation, we're able to determine what are the processes in place, what are the set agendas, what does culture and climate look like, and how do we interact with that. Our field consistently furthers our knowledge in very complex ways. We look at areas such as bias and discrimination and prejudice, and how those things also can impact organizations and systems and also society overall. So, successful DEI requires a fundamental understanding of the complexities of human behavior and the beliefs and values that incentivize behavioral change, right? Because it's not just understanding how we show up, but also understanding adaptation to culture and how the culture can also promote the how people show up in the best version of themselves, right? And so that dynamic sometimes is not as easy as it sounds when we're really applying those individual aspects of human behavior. So I have a couple more things that I want to say to that. When we're tapping into psych science as it relates to DEI work, it can help in tackling those issues, like I said, around bias and discrimination. But also, at the same time, the other side of that coin is creating psychologically safe workplaces and places where people feel that they have a strong sense of belongingness. The other thing that we have been studying quite a bit is around combating bystander effect. So when employees are seeing something happening, but they don't know what to say or how to say it or who to talk to, how we are able to shape behavior so that those bystander moments can actually become learning moments for employees and their colleagues. And how to create trusting, empathetic, and affirming environments as well. What our research shows is that we have to change attitudes. And in order for us to change attitudes, we must change behaviors first. And that we know that people have the capability and the opportunity, plus the motivation to change those behaviors if we set them up the right way. So there are so many aspects of this in which the utilization of psych science can really advance the agenda of DEI and advance it in a way that is individualized to the particular culture and climate of organizations. And, I just want to make sure that we offer that to this community as a possibility as we are expanding the definition and, in a lot of ways, reimagining how we are going to implement DI principles in our workplaces and between us as organizations and colleagues.
And just to continue to build on that conversation, Dr. Akbar, one of the golden threads or the principles of this conference is really about how do we elevate the work in diversity, equity, and inclusion to the highest strategic level. And we know that one of the levers in doing that is knowledge. And having knowledge from a deep technical perspective can often raise that bar to a strategic level.
Absolutely. And there are so many ways in which we're able to do that. I think that when we have employees with different ability levels, right, or different socioeconomic statuses, things that are really particular to the DEI work, how do we help to create ways in which we can incentivize them? How do we contribute to the meaningfulness of their work, right? How do we bring that all to a place where our employees feel valued? I think another way that we can look at this from the idea of psych science is, creating, there's people intervention and there's organizational intervention. And there's lots that, leadership science has to say around this that is connected to psych science, or organization and industrial psych science has to say about this. But what we've seen is that there are models that have been created, and that those models can be applied for organizational solutions around these issues. And so if we take, let's say, one aspect of DEI, for my work right now, we're focused on a lot of racial equity work, right? And you take the example of a psychologist named Dr. Janet Helms. She has a model that's called the Racial Identity Social Interaction Model that looks at organizational dynamics, right? And if you're trying to advance that one piece of DI in your space, you can rely on that model for steps, for tools, for ways in which you can implement that into your ecosystem. So these are the kinds of ways that I'm saying that the application of psych science can actually enhance the environments that we're trying to create in our workplaces.
What a great segue. Let's dive into application, and let's dive into practically. We have a lot of people in our audience who, are charged with application, and they're charged with putting things in place. And so I'd love to dive in there. What might you bring to the forefront of this conversation around application?
Yeah, there's three major things that that I'm gonna sort of base it on, especially the evaluative way in which we utilize psychological science to really combat any societal issue, but in particular the way that we're using it around DEI strategies. The first thing that I would say, and I think that many DEI practitioners that I've spoken to already do this, but I'm going to reinforce it, is that data drives DEI. If we don't understand where we're starting, if we don't understand where we've been, and if we don't understand the baseline of where we are, then we'll never understand where we're going, right? And so data collection is also not a one-time activity that you do and then complete, and then you say you're done. It's an ongoing way to measure progression around DEI strategies. There's lots of different ways in which you can apply data collection based on your DI principles, but it is necessary. And it could be very tempting when there's a crisis, right? DI tends to be very crisis driven and responsive to issues that are happening. It could be very tempting to jump right in head first and just apply the intervention without understanding what's really happening and what drove us to where we are. So I always recommend take a minute, take a step back. Let's collect the appropriate data. Let's gather it, understand it, and then we pivot and we begin to apply the appropriate interventions. And the reason I say that is because if we jump in head first and we don't know where we started, it is very difficult to build in accountability. And if you don't build in accountability, then outcomes and goals become very grayed. And then when you're asked about impact, it's difficult to understand where the impact has really been. But if you're able to show in measurable ways where we started, the application of outcomes and goals that are associated, how accountability has been held along the way, then you are more readily able to demonstrate impact. I would say that within this data piece that I'm talking about, this part one, not to forget history. At APA, we took a very long time to be accountable for our history and for the harms that our profession and our association has done against communities of color and other communities. That history is so important because if we don't understand our history, then we tend to repeat cycles that we can't break. I mean, it's the legacy of sometimes what lives in different industries. And it was very painful and very hard for us to go through that process. But we believed that there was no way that we can advance and advise and make recommendations around psych science in the space of DEI if we didn't contend with our own history and become accountable for that history and then apologize for what we've done. So I would say that if there's an opportunity for that go ahead and do it because it really does help to heal some of those historical harms. So that's part one. Part two is what we call, within the field of psych science, collective responsibility, right? Shifting workplace culture is not the sole responsibility of the chief diversity officer. I don't know if that's a news flash for anybody, but if it is, I'm letting you know, I'm reinforcing and affirming it for you that it is not just your job, or the diversity task force or the employee resource group. In fact, DI is everyone's responsibility, right? It needs to be incorporated in the overall strategy of the business. It needs to be accountable for not being superficial or performative, which can happen sometimes when we're being reactive and not purposeful. And we need to demonstrate ways in which we can see it in the overall strategy for organizations in order for it to gain traction. So these are all ways in which it's important for DI to be prioritized within the larger strategic plan of the organization. So some keywords really quickly, Audrey, that I would like in this part two, right, which I'm calling DI is a collective responsibility, that I would love to hear when I'm reading strategic plans or when I'm reading, mission and vision, when I'm reading those kinds of things that set aside where the organization, where your firm is going, is leadership and infrastructure, psychological safety, inclusive policies and practices, cultural and emotional intelligence, access and equity. Those are the kinds of words that I would love to see incorporated when we're talking about how to build in a DI strategy into the overall larger organizational culture. And then do you want me to go into the third one, or do you want to pause there for a second just so we could take a breath?
Yeah, I was going to take a breath, and then I was actually going to, in the spirit of this conversation being emergent, I was going to bring our audience in. But just on the data drives DEI, I think the big headlines that I heard is there's so much opportunity to be seduced by the urgency, and yet we have to pause before we push. And
Yes.
and I that's really the big takeaway there. And then the second is that DEI is collective and it's everybody's responsibility. And I wanted to bring one of our audience members in who are really asking, how do you address the issues at the senior level, at the executive level, regarding the stigma that if you ask for help, you're viewed as weak. And I'd love if you could hop in and give your perspective there.
Yeah, I think that we are beyond now people separating our mental health, our need to feel that we belong in cultures, that our workplaces need to be healthy, that we're really beyond the conversation that that is a demonstration of weakness. And it makes me really sad to hear that that is still a common reaction, because the psychological science around this, and this is what I want the audience to really take away, is that we have data and research to demonstrate that is actually a detriment to consider these, areas of need for staff and for culture as weaknesses. And it's a detriment to replace, just pushing high performance as the key driver to culture and success, without looking at sort of like the soft skills that are necessary for job performance. The data doesn't lie. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not saying it just because I want to. I'm saying it because that's what's based on what we understand that the science has said, and the science leads us to be able to create the kind of workplaces that we're looking for. So we can't say that we want to create healthy workplaces. We can't say that we're a high, think about that, even the definition of high performing environments, what that means. In order for somebody to be a high performer, they have to be able to come with their whole selves to work. I just can't see it any other way. It's like detaching the mental health from the physical health. Well, we're one people, we're one person. We can't detach those. Those things come together. And so what I would say is that we have lots of resources on the APA website that can support having a very concrete conversation about the fact that we have, demystified the idea that this is at all anchored in weakness. And we have supported the notion that this is absolutely based on the psychological science that's necessary to drive, DI in our environments.
Yeah. Let's stay there. Let's stay there just for a little bit longer. We have a lot of folks in our audience, and what we hear from them is, we struggle to really influence the top of the house, and we struggle to influence our leaders. And certainly, one way you can do that is with data, and certainly that's an important way. But what about this idea that you talked about earlier, Dr. Akbar, which is really around attitudes, behaviors, lived experiences, and ultimately mindsets? What practical advice would you have for our audience around changing some of the mindsets of the executive teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we're going to look at this again from a humanistic sort of perspective, the expectation can't be that we're going to change the behaviors of the executives without changing their attitudes first. So, because behavior leads after attitudinal changes, right? And so a lot of us focus on behavior because that's what we see when we're interacting in an interpersonal type of way. And we don't think about the attitudes. And attitudes are the way that we see things, the way that we believe things to be, our moral compass, our values, how we grew up, our worldview. And so, one of the best ways that this can happen is by having conversations about the way that people see, DEI in the environment. Why ask more questions? Why is it important to have a chief diversity officer? Why is it important to have a resource group? Why is it important to have, to have a task force that's focused on DEI principles? If you can get people to talk about the why, you can get them to understand that the how needs to be tied to the why. So, how we do it needs to be tied to why they think we should do it. And so, I would enter these types of conversation not trying to sell or justify the importance of DEI. I would enter the conversation with curiosity around why what they're saying doesn't align with what they're doing, right? And the only way that you can do that is to target the attitudes that led to the conversation around DI to begin with, because then we get people to challenge their own thinking and how they're showing up or not showing up in alignment with the way that they were thinking or expressing those thoughts. Do you see
Yeah,
what I'm saying, Audrey? Yeah,
indeed,
it's
indeed.
a different approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's back to this idea of pause before push. But the pause this time is not just about the data. The pause is about what kind of questions could I ask that are grounded in curiosity? And that could sound like, I wonder what, I wonder why, I wonder, uh, I wonder. And those types of questions can lead to curiosity and really help. Um, this is a really big question, and we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah.
But there's so many questions that we have around how can we really help employees in our organization that are mentally fatigued by these constant influx of traumatic events, all the way through the gamut. And we don't need to talk about them, but Dr. Akbar, what would you offer?
It's so funny. I just finished having a conversation with the NFL around this, and they wanted to specifically target how it leads to like burnout. And what we have seen is that the emotional tax of what's happening in society, and the thing is that, as we all know, is that it really hasn't let up, right? It's like one thing after another, after another, after another, and we're seeing extremely high rates of burnout in our employee ecosystem. And one of the things that I shared during that talk is that the higher the burnout, the lower we get in compassion and empathy. So the more that our employees and our staff and our administrators and our leaders come into work with the overwhelming feeling of burnout, the less compassionate that they're going to be and available to talk about things that are deeply, emotional or hard, like conversations around DEI, right? So we have to understand that, and we have to watch out for that and make people aware. Education, you said this, like consistent educational campaigns around burnout and mental health. And, we use this sort of work-life balance kind of language, but sometimes that doesn't really capture what's going on. The last thing that I'll say about this is another conversation that I had with another audience. And, what I said to them is I would love to sort of promise in this call, and the same way that I did in that conference, that like everything is going to be okay. I would love to promise that and mean it, but then I would be lying to this audience, right? And as a psychologist, what I do know is that the unpredictability of our environments is going to continue, at least for the short term, if not for the long term. The audience that I just talked to was around parents and teachers. And I had mentioned to them, to date, there's been 27 mass shootings in schools. 27. It's only June. And so think about what that means for parents that are at work, for caring for their children, for what that means in terms of stress and burnout. And so part of what we have to redesign in our minds is that we have to just learn better ways to cope rather than waiting for it to be alleviated, because that's a false expectation that's going to lead to disappointment. And so applying coping skills that really matter to you as an individual is the best way to go. And that, again, I'm going to go back to that collective responsibility, not just on the employee, but that we have to share in that, because I've said this over and over again, a collective problem requires a collective solution. Yeah.
Yes. I know. This conversation has been fabulous. We are a couple of minutes over, Dr. Akbar. We could have went much longer. We've got tons of questions about resources. Please go to the APA website, and Dr. Akbar has said that there's quite a lot of resources there that will be made available to you. Thank you sincerely on behalf of the conference board. This has been very, very enlightening and inspiring, and thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, everyone.